Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all of the team here at Heidelberg for the invitation, for the incredible support, and for creating this amazing intellectual environment. We are all truly privileged, so I extend my great thanks. And today I'm going to talk about a new project that I inadvertently did as the result of the 2-year delay in attending this symposium. So sometimes slowness is of great value because it produces opportunities for things that may not have otherwise happened. So I'm going to start my talk by contextualizing this accidental new research project in relation to the work that I have already done. And so my first book, Undoing Optimization, was published in 2021 in the midst of the pandemic. And the argument of this book is that civic participation is shaped through technological logics. And this is representative of an uneven power dynamic in terms of how knowledge is created, but also, and very importantly, how knowledge is framed in relation to the promise of technology, or to what is sometimes called the technological imaginary. And so I am interested in particularly the idea of technology-led optimization. And we often talk about optimization, and I'm going to advance a useful working definition of optimization, which is the improvement of a particular system within defined bounds. And I think optimization is a logic that applies across all kinds of areas of things that we have been discussing over the last days, things like the development of AI systems, things like the planning of different kinds of urban environments, and things like digital transformations. Optimization is a social logic that accompanies a kind of technological change, and that structures a certain kind of technological imaginary. So in general, my work is concerned with what ideas about, and as well as the infrastructures of technology create. So what is created within a shared public imagination about what is possible to do as a citizen. So that is why I'm interested in smart citizenships. And in particular, today, I'm going to talk about the concept of smart governance. And when we talk about governance, this is again one of these words that has emerged, as Wendy Brown argues, within the context of neoliberalism. Governance, as Brown argues, is often a replacement for a kind of strict regulatory environment. So governance is about assembling stakeholders and hearing many different views, but not necessarily about creating a framework for one entity to enforce a set of democratically agreed regulatory positions. So governance is already very fluid. Governance in the context of optimization can tend towards governing in relation to existing technological frames or these technological imaginaries. So what I'm interested in this context is not only how do these large processes like optimization and smart governance work, but what do people do within them? And so how are citizens able to act within these kinds of environments? So in this talk, I'm going to talk about how citizens engage with this in a kind of discursive way, how people try to talk to each other within and try to figure out how to act within this environment. And this is where this concept of friction becomes really significant. Because when you have an optimizing system, when you have this language and practice of optimization, which is to try to encourage a system to operate smoothly within certain bounds and in line with certain features that you've decided to optimize for, the things that are not in line with what is being optimized for create friction. They might produce glitches, or they just make things work less well. And I am very interested in these kinds of frictions. And in this talk, I'm going to connect these kinds of frictions with different forms of dissent. So my research question for this project is, how do citizens engage with smart and data-based governance? And here I talk about how and here's a summary of what I've just said, that civic action is shaped by the logics of optimization, the invitation to embed action within data-based systems, and through appeals to forms of knowledge that are constructed through social dynamics driven by technocratic dynamics, which include investments in smart cities. So this is an exploration of this concept of friction, which articulates with some of these other concepts that appear across my broader field of work. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how smart governance has been understood within the literature, what structures this form of governance might provide for participation, including what we might think of as civic participation, which has been constructed as something necessary for the functioning of democracy. And I'm going to talk really specifically about a particular problem space that has emerged as an example of smart governance, which is the creation of what are called low traffic neighborhoods. And so this is going to be a dialogue with Nancy as a planner, because these are planning strategies. These are strategies to reduce the movement of vehicles, motor vehicles, through dense urban areas. And I will talk a little bit about how low traffic neighborhoods have been designed, how they have been defined in policy terms. And then I will talk about what is the real object of this small project that came out of my time reflecting on all of this, how citizens in London have responded to the framing of these low traffic neighborhood policy proposals within a strategy of smart governance. And so I'm going to specifically be talking about people arguing against these low traffic neighborhoods. I'm not, and so I will sort of lay out what the smart governance process has been, how consultation is constructed, and then we are going to try to understand people who think this is a terrible idea. And I am going to talk about, in particular, sort of three aspects of critique. And I'm going to show how the aspects of critique build upon each other to create a space for political polarization and for the emergence of a kind of populist political stance. And the arguments begin with something that is quite sensible in this kind of smart governance frame, or rational, you might say, which is that people should be allowed to critique these forms of data-based governance. They should be allowed to use the data that's provided by the government in their own way to kind of create an alternative position. They should be able to collect their own data. But what happens, as we'll see, is that this space of dissent goes in a different direction. And that is because in many ways, the framework of smart governance does not provide enough space for feeling, for the kinds of feelings that people have about their position as citizens, about their relationships to each other, and about the lived experience and the kind of embodied knowledge that they have about the place that they live. And I think this opens up a very dangerous political space, and I think that is what we're going to see through the rest of this talk. So first, I want to situate all of this in relation to the concept of smart governance. And so, again, we're talking about kind of socio-technical frameworks here. We are talking about kind of these imaginaries that are produced socially through the kind of influence of technologies. So smartness is both a technological mandate and a governance frame. And Arit Halpern argues that the logic of optimization is the operational version of smartness. And I'm not going to unfold Halpern's very complex outline of the notion of smartness, but I will say that what she identifies is that smartness is actually not really grounded in an embodied experience of place. And so the way that she describes this in her work is that smartness operates on the zone, which is a space of abstraction. And I think this connects nicely with what Jeremy was talking about in terms of the sort of abstraction of the world into a kind of a tokenized version. So smartness operates on a kind of abstracted geography, which cannot, because of the way that it is assembled, create the opportunity for knowledge of embodied experience to be treated in the same way as other forms of knowledge, notably kind of data-based or extracted or mapped knowledge. So smart technologies are positioned as tools for more effective control and management of complex urban environments. So we hear about sort of top-down smartness. This image is of the Hangzhou City Brain project, and Rob Kitchen has also written about this notion of top-down smartness, the ways that different kinds of data streams are pulled out to describe particular aspects of territory and then recombined in another location, for example, in a control room, to provide this kind of dashboarded or abstracted version of the city in kind of 2 dimensions in terms of its manageable infrastructural elements. So here we can see very clearly this notion of optimization as being the operation of smartness, because these engineers who are using the city brain system are very clearly looking at some kind of like road network here. If you wanted to optimize for traffic flow on a road network, that is a very solvable problem using this kind of abstraction, right? You can very easily say, we are going to optimize for either a smooth movement of traffic, or we are going to optimize for an average speed of traffic. As I talk about in the book, I have a much longer unfolding of the contrast between this top-down smartness with a kind of notion of a bottom-up smartness. Because, of course, this abstraction removes the capacity for people's specific experience to be part of the smart conversation. And many people in the field of smart cities are concerned with making space for a kind of bottom-up smartness. There are, of course, real issues with how that bottom-up smartness is enacted. And in the book, I talk about the kind of network-based smart city, the data-based smart city, and a sensing smart city, and look at how people engage with them all in a kind of potential bottom-up settings. However, we sometimes run into problems such as the fact that strategies like hackathons that suggest a space for citizen engagement using data and using these ideas of kind of smartness and involving citizens in the process of optimization are often really not adequate to foster inclusivity, because they are solution-oriented and they narrow things down towards the things that are already easy to optimize. So governance processes within smart cities, therefore, embed logics of optimization, even when they create space for co-creation using these smart city resources. So you end up having the participation in creating the bottom-up smart city having to use the same intellectual resources as the top-down smart city. There's another kind of aspect of governance here, which again connects with the kind of shift toward neoliberal governance that we've been talking about for the last 3 days, which is, in this case, the diminishing role of the state and the increased role for different kinds of information intermediaries, like technology companies, businesses, and academic institutions, who are invited through this multi-stakeholder framework of smart governance to participate more strongly in establishing the ways in which different kinds of decisions are to be made. And this, of course, as I was saying, creates the risk that citizen perspectives are tokenistic or technology-driven. And and co-creation can often be directed towards optimization from the perspective of technocratic actors. So by seeking to make citizen participation legible, it streamlines citizen participation towards logics that are more interpretable from the position of the already dominant actors, which are, in this case, the technology companies, and the state, who is attempting to be a lean state and is therefore already enacting decision-making processes that are perhaps different than they may have been in the past. So this is something that Neutje Maris has also pointed out more broadly in the sociology of participation, and of course challenges many of the frameworks for citizen participation that have been presented in the planning literature, including this idea that Sherry Arnstein created of this ladder of participation, or a kind of spectrum of participation in which at some point not only are citizens being consulted, but they are also being listened to, and their points of view are actually being taken into account. So we have, with the expansion of sort of neoliberal paradigms more generally, but specifically with this optimization paradigm and smart governance, a kind of narrowing of participation. So what does it mean to live in the big data optimized city? That's where I'm moving from these kinds of sort of broad questions about governance to my very, very specific study in which I can unpack some of the dynamics. So this is actually a map of where I live. And it's also a very common rendering of a certain kind of smart city optimization. This is the back end website for Citymapper, which is one of these sort of optimization apps that one uses in a large city like London to figure out how you get from A to B. And I use Citymapper almost every day to try to figure out what is going to be the fastest way to take public transport from my house, which is actually oddly enough on this map, to another part of the city. And when if we understand that the big data optimized city involves our participation in continually improving, for example, the database of real-time information that Citymapper is actually selling to Transport for London, we start to understand that this is, in fact, a kind of optimized civic participation. Right, so we are sort of subject here to a kind of existing daily life within a paradigm of optimization. But we're also living in a highly suboptimal lived setting. And one of the reasons for the rise of route planning apps is that it is increasingly congested in inner London. There is very heavy traffic. There is too much traffic. The air quality in London regularly exceeds all of the maximum measures for healthy air quality. Right, so this is something really difficult. So what should city planners do about these two problems? We have these two problems. The air is terrible, and there are too many cars on the roads. And so planners are also optimizing. So they are thinking long-term. They are thinking, how do we address the climate emergency? How do we reduce the number of vehicles physically on the road in a congested inner city? And how do we try to improve air quality? And the response, one of the responses, is to create these low-traffic neighborhood policy plans. So the City of London has a very interesting governance structure in itself. So the City of London has very little power itself. It receives money from the federal government, from the central government, but actually all of the decision-making on issues of, for example, land use are delegated to local councils. And there are 32 local councils, and each of them has a population of under 500,000 people. So you can think of London as a mega city, as a sort of like umbrella space, which with sort of governing bodies of very different kinds of places within them. However, there is one agency that governs all of London, and that is Transport for London. So Transport for London is responsible for the roads, the buses, and the underground. And so Transport for London, along with the local governments, instituted a huge range of these low-traffic neighborhood proposals during 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. In many cases, these schemes were instituted using emergency legal provisions that permitted the introduction of new policies without oversight from the public, and without the same level of consultation as might have been expected at other times. And in all of these schemes, there have been sort of different sorts of efforts to either after the fact or during the process of creating these policies, do some kind of consultation. Due to the pandemic and other larger kind of governance directions, these consultations have occurred online. So this is a screen grab of one of the mapping efforts to map potential decisions about which kinds of local roads to close off to through traffic. This is one of the features of a low traffic neighborhood, is that there are different kinds of roads that are expected to be through roads, and other roads cease to be able to have traffic travel on them all the way through the neighborhood. And this is intended to address one of the other issues that has emerged with the rise of route planning applications, which is, of course, up until very recently, if you wanted to drive very quickly through London and you wanted to take an unknown back route, you probably had to be a taxi driver, because taxi drivers would have learned that there were these things called rat runs, which were sort of small streets that could cut diagonally across a neighborhood, and they might drive a taxi down them. With the rise of route planning applications, especially Waze, but also Citymapper, these rat runs are open to everyone. So not only are there more cars on the road, not only is the traffic bad, not only is the air quality terrible, but all of a sudden, people who live on side streets have heavy traffic in front of their houses. So the policy solution is this low traffic neighborhood, which cuts off the capacity for motorized vehicles to drive through neighborhoods and to drive both directions down many small roads. So this is a very, I'm including this in part to demonstrate how difficult this kind of map is to interpret. So this is the consultative map for the London Borough of Hackney as part of their low traffic neighborhood. It is not the one for the case that I'm going to describe, and I will explain why in a moment. But this is the mode of consultation. And when we are thinking about smart governance, and we are thinking about optimization, and we are thinking about the kinds of knowledge that is required to engage in this form of governance, it is important to note that even for me, this is a very intimidating piece of interactive visual imagery. And I think the other thing to note about this kind of this kind of effort at civic optimization is that it is not interpreted in a way that is neutral, right? So we have these are images of different kinds of interpretations of low traffic neighborhoods, and some of them are taken from sites like the one that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So addressing climate change and air pollution seems like a positive goal. However, people often focus on the ugliness and difficulty of the sort of lack of attractiveness and the lack of invitingness, and the changes, of course, in how roads are being used. So this idea of like these really ugly bollards that are in the middle of a road, and where are the cars supposed to drive? The middle image is of a commercial street, which previously had many businesses that were sort of serving people who would come and park in front of them, which now has a sort of single person sitting on some benches in the middle. And then on the far right-hand side, we have a picture of my daughter and the streets around our house, which are also in a low-traffic neighborhood. And of course, she is in the middle of the road, and so are all of our neighbors. But you will notice that our neighbors who are in the middle of the road are walking and not necessarily using wheelchairs, not necessarily people who might have difficulty navigating these kinds of settings. And so now I'm going to start talking a little bit about the discourses that accompany smart governance and the ways that smart governance is presented to citizens. And this is the communication that I received about the low-traffic neighborhood in my area after its introduction. And we can see here that this kind of map is describing responses to the consultations that they presented. So the consultations that they presented were very interesting from the perspective of smart governance. They asked questions like, which of the proposed traffic calming schemes do you like most? and then they actually, I wish I'd taken a picture of this, then they actually made a graph to say that 2/3 of the residents preferred the traffic calming scheme that they had already introduced. And then they put that graph on all of the street poles through the neighborhood, and then they put this map through our door. And I think it's very significant, given what I'm going to present in a moment, about the idea that the last 2 points here are, this question about working with the community to transform this street space at this particular place, which is actually where all the drug dealers hang out, and that is probably why that's there. And then the last one is about further engagement with the community is going to happen to discuss possible traffic reduction. That's because that particular street is the street that is at the boundary of this low traffic neighborhood and is therefore the one where all of the cars, which used to be driving on the other streets, are now driving. So as you are now becoming, you're now all giggling because you're now thinking like, okay, well these schemes, there's something kind of like funny about the lack of consultation, the way that the consultations are framed, and indeed these traffic planning schemes have become extremely contentious. And now there is a discussion in the national media about the legitimacy of these schemes, which is, I find, very interesting because these are, of course, like planning issues, which are often not something that is discussed in the national paper. And even Downing Street, the national government, is giving a hint that they would like, as a conservative government, to transform the national policy to reverse these traffic planning schemes, which of course would mean increasing the traffic on many roads, reducing road safety, because of course when you have many people driving down routes that are on very small and curving roads like the ones where I live, these are extremely dangerous. My daughter would have never walked in the middle of the road. We used to have heavy haulers going down that street where I took the picture. And not just one heavy hauler, but like 6 or 7 on the way to school every morning. So this is very interesting. How did we get from a kind of who could possibly object to a green scheme that is supporting people's ability to walk safely in their neighborhood, that is helping the government to meet their climate targets, that is general. 80% of the people in the UK believe that there is a climate emergency and would like the government to take action. How did we get here? And how legitimate are these kinds of headlines? How representative are they? What is really going on behind? So I decided to follow the dissent. And of course, methodologically, this is something inspired by methods in science and technology studies in the sort of Latourian tradition that suggests we follow the actors, and also in the same tradition that suggests that we focus on controversies and try to understand the nature of controversies, the ways that people disagree with each other. I work in a department of media and communication studies. This means that I myself and many of my colleagues often use methods like discourse analysis. And in the contemporary tradition of discourse analysis, these four aspects are from a paper by Jones and co-authors. We are focused on texts, contexts, interactions, and power. And discourse analysis suggests that paying attention to how people interact with each other through language is really important for understanding how power emerges and where and how power might change. So we're interested in the production of and the connections with forms of structuring power, like party political power, and also in this case with the structuring power of the intermediaries where this discussion is taking place. So we want to look at what is written, how others interact with that, how shared understandings are produced, and where people are engaging, which in this case is on social media. So I spent over a year following an anti-LTN Facebook group. And this is described as a diverse group of residents from a borough in London who describe themselves as adversely affected and deeply concerned by the impact of these low-traffic neighborhood schemes. And as time passed and I observed all of this, I was very interested in the ways that different kinds of leaders shape the language that is occurring. Just make a small note about the presentation of the data and the ethics of conducting this kind of research. I have paraphrased everything that has been presented. And so therefore, none of the words which you are about to read are the ones that were written by the participants. And so I'd like to present to you the unfolding of the discussion. And I'd like to present to you how that unfolding of discussion has shaped a different kind of political space. So, first, people criticize the process. This kind of map thing doesn't work properly. If you have duplicate comments, they're not really being taken into account. And then they start to polarize their discussion. And the discussions start to move from critiques of the process and critiques of the smart governance, the framework of smart governance, towards discussions of the corruption of all politicians, the kind of questioning of how, in fact, these people might have ever been elected, and sort of really like very confusing comments about the capacity of people to, in fact, even use these newly designed roads. And in paraphrasing these comments, I have retained the syntax, I have retained the types of spelling errors, and I have retained the forms of expression, because I think it's very important that these kinds of voices come through. And so, thinking about how this lack of consultation increases and exacerbates inequality, is the direction of travel of this kind of engagement. This is where the discourse is going. And the discourse is going into this idea of this being a kind of like substantive life and death issue for particular people. And also a kind of construction of an us and them, where residents highlight their status in relation to disability, they highlight their status in relation to poverty, or they highlight their identification with a notion of a working class identity. And since I have talked way longer than I was expecting, the other aspect of this that is important is, of course, that Facebook is likely to foreground posts that are more affectively engaging. This is part of the Facebook algorithm, and this is part of the socio-technical structuring of these spaces for citizen participation. And so when your participation is very narrow and is invited on these kinds of mapping platforms that might be extremely difficult to interpret, the place that you go is a place that has kind of infrastructural elements that are going to kind of exacerbate, perhaps, this kind of polarizing discourse. And what resulted in the last couple of weeks of my kind of following of this is, in fact, a political polarization. And as sort of the notions of smart governance, the invitation of citizens to participate in creating kind of more effective or more optimizing logics has in fact opened up a space for a political polarization, and specifically for a kind of libertarian right-wing political invitation, which is, why don't you vote conservative? And why don't you vote conservative to support, I love this, open roads? Which I think discursively is so interesting, right? It is the sort of notion of the American libertarian West, like driving across the open road. So thank you very much for your attention. I unfortunately do not have an update. The local elections in London were yesterday. The voting results for the particular borough that I was following have not yet been released. However, I would like to note that the conservative, local conservative governments in London, there were 2 other boroughs that were traditionally conservative, and all of them have gone to Labour. So I think there's a really interesting question about this kind of dissent and whether this dissent stays in the discursive zone and under what circumstances it moves into the party political zone. Thank you very much, and thank you to Six for the dinosaurs.